not sure if that's what it is the gravestone and the commode. A decade ago, when my family and I moved to Waterville, Maine, we bought a house with a finished basement that was sectioned off into a laundry room and a rec room. The rec room seemed like the best place for me, so when we moved in, I interred myself there, setting up my computer and furniture, my desk, half a dozen bookcases below ground in a room with no window, where it would be quiet and I would not be underfoot, though I was, of course, literally under the feet of my whole family. I worked in that basement room for 4 years, writing my novel Straight Man there before finally putting in a request to come above ground. The problem was that nobody in our family could remember to shut the laundry room door when the dryer was going. And after a couple of loads of towels, the air in the entire basement became thick and dry. "I'm asphyxiating down there," I complained. "I can feel my lungs filling up with lint." Well, as you may know, requests for exhumation are seldom granted. In all the houses that we had ever lived in during my academic nomadship, I had always been relegated to the basement, and this was where my then teenage daughters had come to believe that their father belonged. My wife wasn't thrilled about the idea either. If I was allowed up into the light of day, I might see other things I wanted, and where would it all end? But a movie of my novel, Nobody's Fool, was going to shoot soon, and I was at long last making some money on my writing, which meant that for the first time I actually had some juice in the family. Whatever the reason, I unexpectedly prevailed, and I was allowed to move upstairs and into a room with a window that looked out onto our backyard, near the center of which was a gnarled apple tree that bore and then dropped hundreds of hard, green, worm-infested apples each August. This bitter harvest should not have surprised me. Resting at the base of the tree was a gravestone. When we first moved into the house, I puzzled over the stone, especially its inscription. You'll kind of have to see this in your own mind as best you can. The stone said, Naiman Khalil Kader, born in Syria, 1897, died May 11th, 1925, age 28 years. Well, to Western eyes, the name was odd-looking, Naiman Khalil Kader. It looked like a movie marquee vandalized by children who thought it might be comical to scramble the letters of each word, thereby requiring patrons to rearrange them in order to decide if they wanted to see the movie. I remembered squinting at that first name, Naiman, and tracing the end with my index finger on the cold stone to make sure that that was really what it said, and conjuring in my mind, my warped imagination, a fictional encounter between an old stonecutter and his young apprentice. The old man cuffing the kid in the back of the head and shouting, "Not Naiman, you idiot, Simon!" And here the old man would point to the slip of paper upon which his arthritic fingers had scrawled the name that his apprentice was supposed to carve into the stone. Khalil! What kind of a name is Khalil? I wrote Ralph. Because the very fact that the stone was resting up against our apple tree and not marking a grave suggested that some sort of mistake had been made, right? How many reasons can there be for not using a gravestone? A sudden change of plans? It just turned out to be a bad cold? Most of the explanations that occurred to me were comic, and so, if you thought about it, were the details on the stone. Born in Syria, 1897. Died May 11th, 1925. How's that for parallelism? When you're born, this gravestone seemed to imply, The place is the important thing. The calendar year is specific enough. When you die, the exact date is the essential piece of information. Doesn't much matter where, one place being as good as another. 28 years old, the stone stated specifically, for anyone who couldn't do the arithmetic. Well, my new above-ground workspace had formerly been a family room. The people who had owned the house before us had had a hot tub, and they must have enjoyed it because they took it with them, leaving behind only its octagonal outline on the carpet. We did not aspire to a hot tub ourselves, nor did we wish to be reminded of theirs. So, when we moved in, we'd immediately torn up the old soiled carpet and replaced it with a thick beige one of my wife's choosing. Let's do something about that little bathroom, too, while we're at it, she suggested. There was a tiny 3/4 bath off at what had been that family room, and its few square feet of linoleum flooring was in bad shape. We had some of the beige carpet left over, and so we installed it in the bath. It was only after we did this that I began to notice that other people's bathrooms are almost never carpeted. The reason for this is fairly obvious if you think about it, which we had not. Bathrooms are wet places. Soapy water splashes out of sinks and shower stalls. And men in middle age, I don't wish to be indelicate here, invariably lose some of the precision of their youth. In a matter of months, our 3/4 bath was not the sort of place that we wanted our dinner guests to visit between the pasta and main courses. Also, the carpet in my room was too thick for me to roll around on my office chair. So we decided to cut our losses, tear up the carpet once again, and this time put down tile in the 3/4 bath. In order to lay the tile, the workers had to remove the commode. Well, it may not have occurred to you, but once a commode is pulled up from the floor, it becomes worse than useless. They took ours outside and set it in the middle of the back deck where it would be out of the way. There it sat all afternoon while they laid tile. And every time I passed the window, the sight of it cracked me up. The commode planted out there in the middle of the open air, like an invitation to come clean about all those things that we like to keep private. We had brought in the deck furniture the week before, so the commode hadn't so much as a folding aluminum chair for company. The nearest object of note was 30 feet away, the aforementioned gravestone. For the rest of the day, I chuckled every time I looked out the window. When my daughters came home from school, the first thing I did was to tell them to look out on the deck. The same thing when my wife came home, and in all three instances, their reactions were disappointing. When pressed, each admitted that, yes, the commode did look funny out there, funny in the sense of incongruous. Commodes, after all, are associated with small rooms, and they are often further enclosed within these small rooms and in even smaller rooms. And to see one sitting out there in the open air, catching the last of the swirling autumn leaves, well, my wife and daughters conceded that they could understand why someone might find that funny, especially a man like me who was kind of weird to begin with. Nor could I even begin to explain why the two objects together, the gravestone and the commode, seemed like such a compelling argument against human pretension. That said, I suppose I understand why not everybody would be so impressed by the sight. One of the principal functions of the adult human brain is to assign causes and to classify all observed phenomena. When we see something that strikes us as unusual, our instinct is to explain it to ourselves in a way that makes it less unusual. Experience teaches us not to trouble ourselves unduly about that which is particular. True, we are encouraged to stop and smell the roses, but not all of them, not every one. That would take us far too long, and we do understand the law of diminishing returns. No, teaching Experience teaches us shortcuts. It reinforces our expectations. We learn to make leaps because if we didn't, we would lag behind. When you walk into a house where men are laying tile in the bathroom and you see a commode sitting where it should not be sitting, outside on a deck, the brain kicks immediately into overdrive, supplying a reason, a cause. If the brain did not supply a reason, we would be overwhelmed with the wonder and magic of our existence, much as a child is. It is this magic, this sense of childish wonder, that the adult brain sets out methodically to destroy. Well, part of a writer's job, of course, is to restore a little bit of that magic by slowing down the process by which observations are organized and classified and then dispensed with. Slowing down the explanations for what we observe at least long enough to enjoy and perhaps even wonder at the thing itself. Explanations, in the final analysis, never satisfy us completely. They just reassure us. And that's a lesser thing. Okay, I admit it. I was sorry to see the commode return to its rightful place in our house. Or at least I was until I needed it to be in its rightful place. After that, I was grateful. A couple of years after these events, we ended up moving again. The wonderful movie that Robert Benton made of my novel Nobody's Fool came out and did well, introducing my work to a legion of readers who probably wouldn't have discovered it otherwise, and convincing me that I could maybe make it as a full-time writer. We bought a house on the coast of Maine in which I immediately claimed the biggest, brightest room in it for my study. My wife had been right to see this coming when I moved out of the cellar in the Waterville house. And there I went to work on my novel Empire Falls while we waited for our Waterville house to sell. 2 years we waited. Lowering the price and then lowering it again and then yet again. It came close to selling once until the buyer brought his wife to take a look at the place, and she balked when she saw the gravestone leaning up against the gnarled apple tree. When our realtor called that night to report on the showing, she said, "Could we lose that? The gravestone?" Because apparently there are things that sell houses. The smell of fresh-baked muffins lingering in the kitchen, for instance, and others, like gravestones, which apparently send the wrong message. Anxious though we were to sell the house, we declined to move Nyman Khalil Cater, who had never done us or anyone any harm that we knew of, and who had been resting peacefully, or at least his stone had, in the shade of the apple tree for a good long while. Someone, I felt certain, would come along and appreciate poor Nyman, and eventually someone did. Our reluctance to get rid of Nyman Khalil Cater may suggest that the stone played a more significant role in my writer's imagination than in fact it did. The truth is that until the day the commode sat on the deck and became part of the picture framed by my study window, I had paid exactly no attention to the stone. This despite the fact that I had been riding my mower around it every 10 days or so during the spring and summer for the past 5 years. House guests would sometimes ask what it was doing there, and we would explain that a stonecutter had been the first owner of our home. And then the conversation would move on. It was the commode, somehow, that made the stone interesting, the incongruity of the two objects. As a symbol, at least to one buyer, the gravestone had been powerful enough to prevent the sale of the house, whereas I had taken brief note of its existence and then learned not to see it at all. The short life of Nyman Khalil Cater, born in Syria at the turn of the century and dying in Waterville, Maine, of all places, 28 years later, might have captured the imagination of many a writer, but it hadn't captured mine. I hadn't taken my daughters out to the apple tree and had them trace Nyman's name on the stone with their index fingers and encouraged them to contemplate the mystery of this human life. Even as a symbol of my own mortality, the stone had failed to connect, whereas the commode, had tickled my imagination furiously. And this, I realized, could mean only one thing: that I am, by temperament, a comic writer, which is another way of saying that my most natural way of looking at things is comic. I'm attracted to the comedic, and it's the comedic vision of life that I feel most compelled to share with readers. This is important only because, as writers, many of our decisions about our work are predicated on impulse. Whether we even begin a story is often based on intuition. Will it be fruitful, we wonder? And often we decide yes it will, or no it won't, on the basis of intuition or impulse, before reason is even invited to participate in the discussion. The issue is self-knowledge, which is as important to a writer as it is to anybody else. When I first started writing and studying to be a writer, I had no notion of what kind of writer I would turn out to be. In graduate school, the only kind of writer I wanted to be was a published writer. And I think I would have written anything to achieve that goal. During the first year of my apprenticeship, I sent stories to The New Yorker, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and Cosmopolitan. In fact, I probably sent the same story to all of these magazines. And I desired the same thing from all of these magazines. I wanted their editors to like and admire me. This is despite the fact that, in the artistic sense, there was not as yet a me to like, much less to admire. It was 3 years later that a kind of literary identity began to take shape. Not so much a sense of who I was in real life, as who I became when I sat down to write. I had probably finished Mohawk, my first novel, and was revising it when I began to notice that this book, so full of tragedy and sadness and sentiment, which more than once stepped over the line into melodrama, was most alive in the chapters that involved Dallas Younger, whom we meet early in the story searching for his teeth, which he has gotten drunk and lost somewhere during the preceding night. Watching Dallas careen through Mohawk still strikes me as the truest and most joyful thing about an otherwise pretty dreary book. Allowing Dallas and half a dozen other minor comic characters to coexist with characters who struggled with more serious problems than misplaced teeth gave me an inkling of the kind of writer I might be. The kind of writer that, indeed, for better or worse, I have become. Most people agree that humor can't be taught. People who already incline toward a comic vision of the world can sharpen that vision and work on things like their timing and technique. And writers whose sense of humor runs out of control, diminishing their work's potential for seriousness, can learn restraint. But people without much of a sense of humor are unlikely to develop one through practice. They're like the narrator of The Remains of the Day, who wonders from time to time if he might learn to banter. Though his forays into what he calls witticism are poor, sad affairs. Because humor looks easy, people always want to know how it's done. How do you make things so funny? Writing students used to ask me that all the time, to which I usually replied, I don't make anything funny. I'm simply reporting the world as I find it. Some years ago, I found myself in a Waffle House in Swannanoa, North Carolina, working on a lecture that I was to deliver the next day to the graduate students in the MFA program at Warren Wilson College. It was mid-morning, and the place was empty except for me and the waitress who had brought me my eggs and called me Hun, a sign of affection that I much appreciated, especially after I'd asked her if I might substitute hash browns for the grits, revealing in this request my true nature as a Yankee. Well, it turned out that she was on even more affectionate terms with the next fellow who strolled in and perched on a stool at the counter a few feet from my booth. So how you doing, darling? He said, after taking my measure, quickly taking my measure by my hash browns. "Just fine," she replied, though she allowed, upon further questioning, that as soon as she finished her shift at the Waffle House, she was heading to the dentist to have her lower front teeth pulled. She also had to decide between now and then what kind of bridge she wanted. There was the kind that the dentist just cemented right there, permanent, unless someone punched you in the mouth, but then there was also the kind that you could remove at night and soak in a glass. She explained all this to the man while he ate his breakfast. And the interest that he indicated was apparently not feigned, because when she came to the part about the teeth that you could take out and soak in the glass, the man wiped some yolk off his chin and said, "Yeah, that's the kind I got." And, shades of Dallas Younger, promptly took out his uppers and offered them to her for inspection. Well, seeing this surprising intimacy, I fully expected the woman to take at least one giant step backward, the way you would from somebody else's teeth. But of course, we were in a Waffle House, and I had her all wrong. Not in the least bit squeamish, she took the man's choppers delicately between her thumb and forefinger and held them up to the light while he explained the advantages and disadvantages, not all of which I could follow, since he clearly needed the teeth to make certain phonetic sounds. The waitress had no trouble following him, though, and by the time he finished, her mind was made up. She wanted teeth just like his, except pointing up. Now, my point here, of course, is that there is no need for any fiction writer to make the world a funny place. The world is a funny place for anyone with eyes to see, or rather with the right eyes, because not everybody would actually see those teeth, just as not everybody would truly see the commode on my back deck. The writer has to see things twice. He has to see the thing and then see its potential for use in a story. What he sees twice is, in a sense, who he is. It's his artistic personality. Conversely, what he doesn't see twice is just as revealing. I didn't see the gravestone in my backyard twice until I saw it as part of a comic frame. It had to be called to my attention repeatedly by other people for me to acknowledge its significance. The problem for writers with a genuinely comic imagination is not making things funny, or even locating enough funny things in the real world to write about. Rather, the problem is, and it's the same for any artist, the problem is getting other people to see things our way, to honor the truth of our idiosyncratic way of seeing. Art, in the end, may be little more than this: getting people to see things your way when they're used to seeing things their way. That's what the Impressionist painters ultimately succeeded in doing with nature, right? The greatest obstacle that comic writers face is that far more people truly see the gravestone than truly see the commode. These people look out on the world and they see death, ignorance, poverty, bigotry, injustice, and they see nothing funny about any of it. Worse, they suspect that there must be something wrong with people who do. Such humorless people are not, and I do want to stress this, they are not stupid. Often, they are among the kindest, most sensitive, and generous people we know, which makes their blindness, for that's what it is, all that much more difficult to deal with. Not long ago, I got in a heated argument with a woman I'll call Jane at a dinner party. We had been friends for years, but she had no idea what she was stepping in when she remarked, innocently enough, "That's not funny." The subject was either speech impediments in general or stuttering in particular. I don't remember which. But when I looked back now on what ensued, I realize that there probably was no need for us to have argued at all. Like most arguments, most unnecessary arguments anyway, this one began by neither of us saying precisely what we meant. But rather than admit this, we chose to defend the positions that we had clumsily staked out. We might very well have agreed, for instance, that it's not nice to make fun of people with speech impediments. I'm not nearly as nice a person as Jane is, but I'm not inordinately cruel either. And further, we might have agreed that stuttering is not the least bit funny to the stutterer, especially if the stutterer is very young and self-conscious. Every day, this person is betrayed by his own body in ways that it's difficult for the rest of us to imagine. His affliction makes him look foolish and slow-witted, and chances are that he's neither. But alas, the position that my friend Jane had chosen to stake out and defend was that stuttering was not funny. And to this, I took strident exception. For one thing, I imagined that I had caught a whiff of righteousness in her pronouncement, and so, of course, I was immediately on point. The example that she used to illustrate her contention, the stammering actor in the movie Shakespeare in Love, who has such heroic difficulties introducing Will's play, was, to my mind, a far more useful example for me and my argument than for her and hers, and I said so. Of course, I was more than casually vested in the argument, since my own novel, The Risk Pool, contains a stutterer. And if I understood Jane's argument correctly, the screenwriter of Shakespeare in Love was guilty not just of insensitivity by abusing a fictional character, but also of causing unnecessary pain to legions of real-life stutterers who went to the movie and discovered themselves to be the objects of mirth. If my friend was correct in her assessment of the moral landscape of the movie script, then, by extension, I owed an apology not just to my own fictional character in my own novel, but also to real-life stutterers who had read the book. And the number of these could not have been great because the number of readers of that novel, at least at that time, was not great, but still, I stood accused. "What about Michael Palin and A Fish Called Wanda?" I said, never suspecting as I did that I was providing her with the very example she was trying at that moment to recollect in support of her untenable position. "Are you seriously telling me," I asked, "that Michael Palin, trying to spit out the words Cathcart Hotel to a frantically impatient John Cleese, isn't funny?" "Indeed it was not," my friend informed me. "It was cruel, was what it was, and she had nearly walked out of the theater." "Oh, right," I mocked. "You nearly did. Nearly." Jane had by now withdrawn several layers deep, and her mouth, clamped tightly shut, had become a thin line. But I did not let up. "What about the clergyman in The Princess Bride?" I forged ahead. I could do a fair imitation of this character, and I leaned toward Jane, not particularly caring that she leaned away from me as I did, and I said, "Wov, sweet wov." Well, there were half a dozen people around the table, and except for Jane, everyone was laughing now, and I was on a roll. One of the worst speech impediments I had ever run across belonged to a good-natured fellow with a large family that he used to like to take to the A&W Root Beer Drive-In, where the kids invariably acted up. The particular sound that he had trouble forming was the letter G, which he would replace with a D whenever he got excited. Naturally, the kids, all crammed into the back seat like that, liked to get out and run around the car, slamming doors as they did, and ignoring their father's instructions to cut it out until he would finally scream at them, much to the delight of the people in the nearby cars, "If you're donna did in, did in. If you're donna did out, did out. No more goddamn didn't in, didn't out." Well, it turned out that wasn't funny either, according to Jane, which left me with no choice but to parade every stutterer I knew, real and imagined, before the poor woman who seethed visibly in justifiable indignation at my boorish behavior. I didn't stop until I had exhausted my entire store of speech impediment memories, and then, only reluctantly, allowing the conversation to move on, though throughout the rest of the evening, whenever I saw the natural color returning to Jane's cheeks, I would lean toward her and whisper, "Wov, sweet Wov." If she'd had a gun, I'm quite sure she would have shot me dead. And that, to her way of thinking, would have been hilarious. Of course, I called her the next morning, and she graciously accepted my apology. "I guess humor is subjective," she allowed, causing me to wish I hadn't called. And I hung up quickly when I felt the word "wov" forming on my lips. In the end, of course, laughter is serious business. And the inability to laugh at the world and at ourselves is a sign, at least to my way of thinking, of mental illness. Mark Twain, overcome by loss and bitterness and despair near the end of his life, stopped laughing, but he never stopped believing in the power of laughter. The angel Satan in The Mysterious Stranger fragments, which were among the last things he ever wrote, reminds human beings that, quote, "against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand. You humans, you're always fussing and fighting with your other weapons. Do you ever use that one? No, you leave it rusting because you lack sense and courage." Or, as the critic Catherine Powers puts it, quote, "We Americans worry about humor, confusing it with a lack of seriousness. But look here. Along with art and immorality, it's humor that distinguishes human beings from the animals. It is, furthermore, a truly civilizing force, a nemesis to the big battalions, a vexation and a puzzlement to the purveyors of mediocrity." To some, it may seem counterintuitive that laughter should be a sign of high seriousness, but frequently it is. Laughter is often a much more complex and thoughtful emotional response than tears, though we seem to think that being moved to tears is somehow more noble and thoughtful than being moved to laughter. But Oscar Wilde was correct to ask that who among us can read of the death of Dickens' Little Nell in the old curiosity shop without laughing? Mirth remains our best hedge, not just against sentimentality, but also self-importance. It's also a natural antidote to piety. When people insist that something is not funny, they're often expressing more of a wish than a conviction. Feeling sympathy for stutterers, we would much prefer that the affliction were not so comic. If we were better people, we suspect, it wouldn't be. We desire to be better than we are, for the world to be a better, less cruel place than it is, and surely it would be a better place, such well-intentioned people reason, if we could just suppress our own dubious natures. That our impulses are sinful, our natures fallen, is, of course, a Puritan view. And the Puritan strain in America has always run wide and deep, taking many unpredictable forms. The neo-Puritan, politically correct humanists of the contemporary academy have much in common with the fundamentalist Christians that they claim to abhor. I don't mean to suggest that everything is funny or that all things lend themselves equally well to humor. The attacks of September 11th weren't funny. But it turns out that in the aftermath of the terrorism that brought down the World Trade Center, reports that irony was dead proved premature. True, the magnitude of that tragedy made it somewhere between difficult and impossible to imagine laughing anytime again soon. Like many writers, and not just comic writers, I was unable to put pen to paper for quite a while. For weeks, indeed months, the act of filling a page with words seemed both futile and silly. But laugh we did, eventually, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. Never mind how uncomfortable those first laughs made us. Often, our discomfort is the very point of laughter, the point of the joke. Here, for instance, is a joke that you've probably heard. And I'm more than a little ashamed to admit that, yes, I think it's funny, though the joke never fails to make me squirm. It goes like this. What do you tell a woman with 2 black eyes? Answer, nothing. She's already been told twice. Can such a joke be funny when domestic violence is not? Well, yes, if you can live with the complex ambiguities that humor often demands. The absurd notion that for some men, telling and punching are synonyms is funny. I don't think that the joke approves of such men or of their behavior. It just makes a note of it and asks us to recognize its sad truth. That said, the way some men laugh at this joke makes me very uncomfortable indeed. The tone of their hilarity suggesting their thorough appreciation. Yeah, that's the only way to tell a woman anything, it seems to imply. But I guess that's my point. In the end, it's my fellow human beings that make me nervous, not jokes. The other reason that laughter often makes us squirm is that it's no great respecter of circumstance. It refuses to be contained like dessert at the end of the meal. It will turn up, uninvited, at its own whim. And it particularly seems to enjoy making us uncomfortable, even humiliating us. Before my father died of cancer, he willed his remains to medical research, joking that maybe they could figure out what made him tick, since he never could. As a result, we were unable to have a traditional funeral, which my father wouldn't have wanted anyway. I doubted he would have even wanted the memorial service that we held, but I did that much anyway. I had to. The notice in the newspaper, I thought, made the whole thing abundantly clear. The memorial was held in a large funeral home with several viewing rooms, though my father's was, that afternoon, the only service held there. Had a lot of friends, my father. And before long, the place was crowded, and we'd spilled out of the room that we had been assigned to and into the hallway and then into the adjacent rooms. I was not in the best of shape. Our relationship had been checkered, but during the last years of his life, my father and I had become close, and his loss had hit me hard, in part because I was working on The Risk Pool at the time, a novel that was, though I didn't realize it then, a kind of Valentine, a book that allowed my father and I to have the kind of conversation that we were ever unlikely to have in real life. In the book, I got to play both parts, a duty I accepted cheerfully enough until I learned that he was ill, which meant that after he died, I would have to play both parts forever, a job I wasn't sure I was up to. Everyone at the funeral home seemed to have a story to tell about my father, and I wasn't able to pay much attention to anyone except the person I happened just then to be speaking to, but at the periphery of my consciousness, I became aware of a tiny, wizened old man who had entered the funeral home uncertainly and begun to look around as if for a daughter or son lost in the crowd, someone that he hoped to lean on. Weaving unsteadily among the crowd, squeezing in between taller people, he methodically made his way down the hall and into the viewing room where the majority of the visitors were congregated. 5 minutes later, he emerged again, still on a mission, crossing the hall into the second viewing room, and then minutes later into the third. And not long after that, I looked up and saw him climbing the stairs into what was surely the private living quarters of the people who ran the funeral home. There, he must have been discovered mid-investigation, because when he reappeared on the stairs, he was guided by a woman who I took to be the funeral director's wife. She had the old fellow firmly by the elbow and was clearly determined to return him below stairs. But at the landing, he stopped, refusing to budge, I could tell, until he had received some satisfaction. No doubt he understood that if he allowed himself to be returned to floor level, he would never succeed in attracting anyone's attention, whereas from the landing, he had the loft he required. "Ahem," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. Most everybody looked his way. "Where the hell is Jimmy?" was what he wanted to know. When I say that laughter is often a more complex and thoughtful emotion than tears, this is what I mean. When the old man asked where the hell my father was, I laughed out loud in spite of myself. That laugh contained, among other things, a small release from the pain of loss, as well as an understanding of the old man's frustration. He'd never been to a memorial service before, had no idea what one was. And there was also guilt, the result of laughing during a solemn occasion, as well as a grim acknowledgement that the old man's question echoed another one of my own, for I'd been imagining all day my father, his cancer-wasted body, lying out on some slab under the scalpel of a research physician motivated purely by scientific curiosity. Where the hell was my father indeed? The final test of whether something is funny or not is whether it's true. I don't, of course, mean whether the incident really happened, or even whether I've embellished it or exaggerated it in the telling. When I ask whether something is true or not, I mean, is it true to our experience of life? Is this the way people really are? Is this truly the way the world works? This, not coincidentally, is the test of all good writing, not just comic writing. The best humor has always resided in the chamber next to the one occupied by suffering. There is a door adjoining these two rooms, and it is never closed all the way. Sometimes it's open just a crack, because that's all we can stand. Most of the time, it's flung open on a well-oiled hinge, and this is as it should be. Those in favor of shutting it tight are always, always, always wrong. The gravestone and the commode coexist in the world, and it's no more our job to ignore either than it is to segregate them, no matter how attractive the separation is made by grief and loss. In John Bailey's eloquent memoir, Elegy for Iris, he describes in heartbreaking detail the descent of his beloved wife into Alzheimer's. Near the end, novelist Iris Murdoch would remember almost nothing about her life, her work, any of the things that had meant the most to her, including the man who was now taking care of her. What she did recall, longer than just about anything else, Bailey says, was the punchline to jokes that she and her husband had always loved. The context of these punchlines had fled, of course, and the poor woman would have been hard-pressed to remember any of the joke's elements. But all Bailey had to do was say the punchline, and Iris would laugh, remembering that whatever he had just said, it had once been funny. Bailey concludes from this, and I think he's right, that there's nothing more fundamental to our shared humanity than laughter. Unless, of course, it's love. Sweet, sweet love.
We have questions from the audience.
While we're collecting the questions, perhaps when we were leaving our house, you said you had a great Chekhov story to tell me. You want to share that with everybody?
Yeah.
Grab some questions.
When I was teaching at Warren Wilson, there was a poet there named Stephen Dobbins, who's a wonderful teacher, a wonderful poet and fiction writer. And he taught mostly in poetry, but every now and then he would teach a fiction writing class as well. And he always used to begin his classes the same way. He would go to the he would go over to the blackboard, he would take a piece of chalk, and he would draw a line that extended from one end of the blackboard to the other. And at one end he would say, it would just say, well, no, it was at the other end, at the far end of the spectrum, he would write on the board, Chekhov. And then he'd go down to the other end, the beginning end, and put a little X and say, you are here.
Well, I have have something for you. Perhaps this woman would stand up, and I think I picked you out. Here is Richard Russo in the 5th grade. And that's you.
That's your classmate.
Hello. What was your name back then? Barbara. How are you?
Do you two want to catch up?
Yeah.
I had a crush on you in 2nd grade. But it didn't last.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you just summed up about 57 years of worth of my experience with women, actually.
Nice talk.
It's a pleasure to meet you, and your books are phenomenal. And I can see Gloversville every other. I just love your books. I admire them. And I moved to Iowa, and here I am. And I remember you.
It's so nice to see you. Now, you didn't send me something a couple of weeks ago about the story about the handwriting? That wasn't you, was it?
It was, but it was 2 years ago.
But here's the funny thing. I just got it. That was you. Aren't you sweet? Yeah. When things go to my publisher, things, and I don't know whether you send it to Random House or Knopf, but things go and they get misplaced, and then I will sometimes read. I will sometimes get things that are invitations for me to come speak to somebody with an offer of $10,000, and it's a year old, and and I think, well, that would have been nice.
One of the questions that's on the card is, could we survive any political campaign without humor? I figure this is a fairly
Certainly
rich
not
vein
this
to mine.
one. I actually, without revealing too much, I don't like to do too. If you and I were sitting down there together and wanted to talk politics, I would do it all night long with you, one individual to another individual. I don't like to talk too much politics as an award-winning writer, because that gives me too much power over a subject that I know more about and probably know less about than you do. So, how I'm going to vote or what my political feelings are couldn't be more immaterial. But during the vice presidential debate, I did find myself, my mind wandering and thinking of a scenario in which Joe Biden was saying, Governor, I know Michael Palin. Michael Palin was a friend of mine. Governor, you're no Michael Palin.
Let me take part of this question, because it's a complex one, but it notes that Philip Roth, your colleague Philip Roth, started out very funny and then got more serious. His books lately make very few jokes. Do you have any comment on that? I don't know if the person who wrote this read Indignation. I just read it last week, and it's pretty funny. But is there a tendency for a comic writer to, I don't know if you want to pick on Philip Roth in particular, but start to take himself too seriously, or start seeing the humor?
I think what happens to comic writers, and I think, first of all, it's an excellent question, and I think that there's a lot of truth to it. And I don't think it's universally true, and I hope it's not true for me. But I mean, in this talk, I just mentioned Mark Twain. That certainly happened to him. The loss of his beloved wife and a lot of financial reverses by the time he got to be an older man. He was just wrecked, and he wasn't laughing anymore. But you also, I mean, there are a number of other writers that we could all name too that were funny as hell in the early going, and in the end had become like Mr. Pickwick in Pickwick Papers. You go through that long novel, and at the end of it, Mr. Pickwick says, "I've seen enough." And you wonder about somebody like Kurt Vonnegut, for instance, who could be a hilariously funny writer. And by the end of his career, boy, there wasn't. There was some humor, but the tone of the humor had changed dramatically. I think that that's true. Also, in the cosmic sense, for Philip Roth. You know, whether indignation, I'm sure you're right, indignation probably is funny, but if you track the arc of his career, I think you would see that his that Goodbye Columbus is one thing, and American Pastoral is another. I have noted in my own work that it has gotten darker. Bridge of Sighs is certainly the darkest of my novels. I like to think it's a very funny book. When I go through it and I read from it on the road, people seem to think it's very funny, but also when they get to the end of it, they feel like they've been put through some kind of ringer, I think. And Lord knows the climax to Empire Falls was that way too. I have another book that I'm working on now, and one beyond that promise, I think, to be very comic, but I can't really say whether they will be for sure or not, because as I said in this lecture, the final test is truth. Are you telling the truth or not? It all has to pass that truth test. And when you're making jokes because or when you're writing comically because you want to be funny, that's a different thing than reporting on a genuinely funny world. But it's an excellent question, and I think that in general, comic writers, you wouldn't think this, but it's the great danger in comic writing, because if comedy does exist in the room right next door to suffering, and if that door is open, then the possibility of suffering leaking in and taking over is very real, I think.
One person asked, "As the Whore's Child is a favorite of mine, of your works, and are there any more short stories coming?" And let me, if I could tack on to that and say, as a narrative is forming in your head, how do you decide ultimately whether it's going to be a short story or a novel?
First, to answer the question, I have published a couple of stories since The Whore's Child. And those will be included one day in a new collection of stories. My imagination is expansive. It just naturally goes outward instead of inward, like some writers do. And for that reason, I don't write that many short stories, or at least I don't set out to write them. And the thing about The Whore's Child is there are 7 stories in The Whore's Child. I think only 3 of them were not originally part of a novel that I took out. So when you think about that, over all the years now that I've been writing, I'm not a young writer anymore, and over the decades that I've been writing, 8 or 9 stories is not a huge output, especially when you consider the fact that 5 of them were originally part of a novel and got yanked out. David, to answer your question, I was just in Paris recently for the French publication of this book, and I was there with Richard Ford and some other writers, and Richard and I had a conversation in front of a group, and Richard said that he always knows right from the start whether something is a short story or a novel. And he said he just couldn't imagine a circumstance in which that wasn't true. That you must at least have some sort of a notion of the size of the box that you're going to put something in. Fortunately, the question didn't come to me. The same question didn't come to me, because the book that I'm finishing up right now, that I hope to deliver in about a month, I started about this time last year. When I got to page 17, I thought I had 2 more pages to write. When I got to page 37, I realized that I had about 10 more pages to write, and that it was no longer publishable as a short story. And then it got to be about 105, and I realized, no, I'm not anywhere near the end. And then it got to be 170, and I thought, wait a second, this is getting publishable again now. And it's now 325 pages. So I certainly don't always know what it is that I'm working on.
I read that you were very proud of being able to produce a slender book, a book of short stories. Can you talk about that for a second? Yeah,
when you're the kind of writer that I am, one of the differences between Richard Ford and I, for instance, I think, and he is a wonderful writer, a writer of extraordinary gifts. But one of the things that was clear to me as we were talking together, talking with each other, is that he exercises a lot more intellectual. He thinks about his stories a lot more before he starts to write them than I do, and he's also much more in control. He holds, imagine it as a sled, a horse-drawn sleigh or something like that. He holds the reins always very tightly. I, on the other hand, barely hold the reins at all, and when you don't hold the reins, you don't know where the horse is going, and you have to be content with where it takes you and hope that it's the right place, and it's going to probably zigzag all over the place, well, like my novels do. That's the reason I was so proud of that collection of short stories, because it exhibited my ability, at least on rare occasion, to exercise some control over my fiction, to get it, to say that this is going to fit in a small box and then put it in a small box. I don't do it very often, and when I do, I just feel gleeful.
As I think I mentioned to you earlier, I'm teaching a course this semester with somebody in the English department on Chekhov and American fiction, and our students find Chekhov very puzzling and difficult for a reason that I think was very deliberate on his part. And there's a very famous quote in a letter he wrote to his brother in which he said that it's not the artist's job to answer the questions, it's the artist's job to pose them properly.
Yes.
You're familiar with it? Do you have any comment on that?
Not beyond saying that he's absolutely right. Chekhov is, I know that students, American students would of course be reading him in translation, but I think Chekhov is one of the most important writers that I can imagine using to teach someone the art of storytelling, because he's a writer of so few gimmicks, you know? And when young people are learning to write, they are often attracted to style, and they're often attracted to gimmickry. Style is, unfortunately, one of the last things to come to a writer, style and voice. You're going to have to learn an awful lot about storytelling before you achieve either a voice or a style that is genuinely your own. Many student writers want to start with style. They want to start with voice. And I always had mixed feelings about that, because I certainly didn't want to silence anyone's voice, and the quicker they want to start working on their style, that's fine with me. But when I was teaching them stories, I always wanted to teach them stories by writers who are so good at what they do that they didn't need a single gimmick. And there aren't that many of them around, and Chekhov is, as Stephen Dobbins said, at the end, and you are here. Yeah.
Madeline, do you have one?
One might have already been answered, was when your next novel is coming out, and your characters engage in interesting, intelligent banter. If one would listen to your conversations with your family and your friends, would you hear the same quality conversations?
Is anyone in my family here?
Do you want to be family for a night? This is my cousin.
Actually, I learned an awful lot about dialogue from listening, especially to my father and his friends. I come from a long line of bullshitters, and listening to those men talk taught me an awful lot. The thing about dialogue, though, is, having said that, the thing about dialogue is, people often think of dialogue, a person who writes dialogue, they think that it's the most natural thing a fiction writer does, and they think of dialogue as something that's realistic. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Will you join me in thanking Mr. Russo for a wonderful evening?
Thank you.